So, Wilson has gone to Congress. He's gotten a declaration of war against Germany. We quickly pack up what army we have, which isn't very much, and send it over to France. Here's troops leaving, heading for France in 1917. They're very excited about going. But we don't have that large an army at this point. These men will serve as the nucleus for what becomes known as the AEF. That's the American Expeditionary Force. AEF, American Expeditionary Force. Those are the troops sent to France early in the spring of 1917, early summer, after we've declared war. Now, we don't have that much of an army at this time. So, if you're looking for action-packed action from the U.S. Military at this point, there really isn't any. They're going to go over, start training, getting acclimated to the way the war works. We have started a draft. Men are being raised here in the States, sent over to France to form new divisions, which is the nucleus of an army, is the division. It's about 15 to 20,000 men at the time, if I recall. And we need somebody in charge of this. So who might you put in charge of this great American Expeditionary Force? Well, how about John J. Pershing? He's back. John J. Pershing, last seen chasing Pancho Villa in Mexico during the punitive expedition. And so the initial troops go over, but not lots going on. Now, one of the things that Pershing has to deal with becomes known as the amalgamation controversy. The English and the French, basically, to simplify things, say, why don't you just put the American troops right into the lines with our troops? Our troops are experienced. They have knowledge of how the war is fought. This would particularly work good with English troops because we theoretically speak the same language. So funnel the Americans into our units as replacements. They can fight side by side. But Pershing wants none of that, and the American High Command will back him on this. He says, the Americans will fight as an American army under the command of American leaders. Because honestly, we're not convinced that British generals or French generals will be that worried about the lives of our men. Okay, the British generals had a bad reputation at this point of being, not affected by large casualties, which we don't have time to go into. Okay. So Pershing's no, we're going to be our own army. And just to prove, to make a point here, we say we are not an allied power. We're not joining the Allies. We are fighting alongside of them. We call ourselves an associated power. We have a common enemy, Germany. But we're not there to fight to regain the Alsace-Lorraine region for France, for instance. So we have our own motives for being in the war, and we'll take care of ourselves. Thank you very much. There is one exception to this. It's I'll mention it because you might run into it somewhere in the book. Black troops. There are some black troops sent to France. They are put under the command of the French army. So that's the exception to the rule. The theory was that the French, because of their holdings in colonial Africa, were used to dealing with black troops, and that they would know how to, handle them properly. So once again, the Jim Crow segregation that's going on in our country at the time kind of rears its ugly head. So most people don't mention that, but if you don't mention it, invariably about every 3 years somebody puts up their hand and asks about it. So I'll just tell you now. Okay. When I took this class, I was the guy who stuck his hand up and asked about it. So anyway, so for during 1917, there's not a lot of Americans involved in combat. Now, what Wilson wants to do at this point is, once again, he's going to try to find a diplomatic answer to this question. He had tried to use diplomacy before we entered the war, wasn't getting anywhere with the Europeans, but now that we're in the war, we have a little more authority to speak, and so he will propose peace based on what he calls the 14 points. Okay? 14 points are like bullet points. Okay, the textbook that we use over in Dallas actually has a chart that shows the 14 bullet points one by one. This book doesn't have it, although it might mention two or three of them. You could Google it, look it up on Wiki if you wanted, just to kind of get a thing about it. Basically, they're all ideas that Wilson has that could hopefully help prevent a future war. He's looking at things that might have dragged, the world into World War One. Says, well, let's see what we can do to stop this sort of thing in the future. Freedom of the seas, national borders, that kind of stuff. But the key one, the one you need to know, the one that is pertinent to us, is point number 14. Wilson would like to create a body, an international collective security body. Okay, he calls it a League of Nations, a place where the countries of the world can send diplomats and get together and talk things out, try to sort out problems in an open forum, without secret diplomacies and alliances and treaties, all of which are seen as some of the things that got the world into World War One. Okay? This is the thing he really thinks could help diffuse future situations and prevent another war. Okay? Does this sound kind of familiar to you? A place where countries of the world can send diplomats and they hash things out and they talk amongst each other. If we were all here in person, somebody might say the United Nations. The League of Nations is like the United Nations 1.0. It's the beta version, which means there'll be some flaws in it. And that's the thing Wilson really has his heart set on. All right. So he's hoping to, negotiate some kind of settlement. One way to keep a bunch of American troops from getting killed in the war is to end the war before the Americans become heavily involved in combat. But this doesn't work. Okay? Now, there's a gap here in the PowerPoint. It says League of Nations and it says Armistice. It basically just doesn't talk about the war at all. So let me throw you out a little detail. Okay. The Allies were there were problems with the British had taken horrendous losses. So had the Germans. So had the French. I mean, everybody's taken massive casualties in this thing. It got so bad that the French army, the whole units mutinied. They said they would no longer attack. They'd stay in the trenches and defend France, but they weren't going to, launch offenses because they had such heavy casualties. So this was going on with the French army particularly. But to really explain kind of what's going on here, we need to turn our eyes for just a second to the war with Russia. Now remember, Russia was one of the three Allied powers. France, England, and Russia were the main Allied powers. And there were some smaller ones, but we won't get into that. And so the Germans are fighting a two-front war. Now, the Russians have taken really heavy casualties in this war, as has just about everyone, to be honest. And in March of 1917, just before the United States declared war on Germany, in March of 1917, there was this revolution in Russia. And the Tsar, that's the Russian king, Tsar, C-Z-A-R. It's like short for, it's like a Russian version of Caesar, king, right, the leader. So the Russian Tsar had been removed from power, more or less. There was I'm simplifying this. I don't do Russian history. But there was a movement to get, a more more democratic form of government, increase the power of the legislature. The Tsar's kind of more or less under house arrest, I suppose would be the easy way to phrase it. And a provisional government has been formed. Okay? Now, the provisional government says that Russia will stay in the war against the Germans, and they do. In fact, if I recall, they launched some offensives in the summer of 1917 that had a little bit of success. But then what happens is in the fall of 1917, there's a second revolution sweeps Russia. It's the Bolshevik Revolution, or the Communist Revolution, if you prefer. The communists seize control of the government and start this civil war, basically. Okay? This happened in either October or November. It's confusing because the Russians were using the old-style calendar at the time, and when you converted over to the new calendar, it changes the month. I believe it was October on their calendar, but November nowadays. But it might be flip flopped. It might have been the other way. I don't. It's not really important. So the communists seize control of the government. They let the Tsar know he's no longer in power by executing him and his entire family, which is kind of how the communists tend to roll. Okay? And now the communist red government will pull out of the war. They will sign a separate peace treaty with the Germans. Okay? The Germans now no longer have to worry about fighting a two-front war. They can pull practically all the troops that were on the German-Russian border and send them to France. And so in the spring of 1918, the Germans will launch a massive wave of offensives, the idea being to try to capture Paris, knock the French out of the war, and seal the deal before the American army is really there in sufficient numbers or big enough to do anything. So in other words, the Germans no longer have to worry about the Russians, are going to go in for the kill against the French and the British. And this happens in spring of 1918. Pause and start a new file.